house on Capitol Hill. You see only the porch here, but they bought a house on Capitol Hill by dint of their hard work and determination. From 1890 to 1910, the Cadens believed that race relations were improving in Seattle and the nation itself. Unfortunately, a reversal of fortune happened in 1910. Essentially, Horace Caden, who was always a Mississippian, he always remembered his Mississippi past, Horace Caden got news that a black man was lynched near his hometown. And as a result, he was incensed at this, and he ran a front-page story of this lynching. This was something the Seattle Republican had never done before. They had always kept so-called racial news in the insides of the paper and political news on the front page. When Caden ran this ad, the subscription rates dropped off dramatically, and eventually the Cadens lost their home on Capitol Hill. They had to move into a rooming house that they owned. Susie Revels Caden eventually had to go to work, and this woman, who was the daughter of a U.S. senator, or former U.S. senator, the daughter of a college president, a woman who had a college degree herself, this woman could find work in Seattle only as a maid. She did day work in Seattle because no one would hire her to do anything else at that time because of her color. By 1914, Horace Caden Sr. had joined the NAACP. Now, this is nothing short of remarkable because Caden would never have endorsed an organization like the NAACP in the 1890s or through most of the first decade of the 20th century. But by 1913, 1914, the situation had changed for him personally, and it had changed for a whole host of blacks in Seattle. If Seattle's social and political climate seemed supportive of blacks, comparatively speaking, and notice I always say comparatively speaking, through 1910, the economic climate was never very supportive. Indeed, Mattie Vineyard Harris, and I want to put her statement on the board here. Mattie Vineyard Harris, I think, spoke a truism about Seattle, a truism that held for a very long time, and some argue that holds right to this day. You know, in the early history of Seattle, there wasn't an awful lot of prejudice, but there wasn't an awful lot of opportunities either. In other words, that's the crux, that African Americans, I've said this before, African Americans remained on the periphery of the economy, even if they had, if you will, social cachet, even if they had the opportunity to interact socially and politically with non-blacks. In short, black women and black men found it difficult to obtain jobs other than as janitors, maids, waiters, and porters. We've already talked about Susie Revels Caden. I think part of the reason for this was the stereotyping that had gone on throughout the country, a stereotyping that goes all the way back to the Civil War. Many upper-class whites and even many middle-class whites in Seattle and elsewhere believed that African Americans were fit only for menial jobs, so they were fit only for domestic servants. And indeed, many of them thought that they were providing or giving blacks or providing a favor to blacks by hiring them in these capacities, because otherwise blacks would not have any work at all. But I would also suggest to you that there is a strange pattern that evolved in Seattle, that evolved throughout its history, and that would get worse before it got better. Organized labor, or what was emerging as organized labor, which would be exceedingly powerful in Seattle, and which ironically would be responsible for much of Seattle's liberal attitude and much of the kind of social service network that Seattle would have long before the rest of the country. Organized labor was exceedingly racist. They were anti-Asian, they were anti-black. And one of the ways in which to see this is to look at the host of organizations that had white in their name. In the 1890s, for instance, the White Cooks and Waiters Union, refused to include anyone who wasn't white. In other words, Asians could not join the union, blacks could not join the union, Native Americans could not join the union, and on and on. And unfortunately, this created a situation that was fraught with tension. Employers knew that the white unions would not accept blacks, and as a result, they decided to use African Americans, among other groups, as strikebreakers. And of course, once blacks became strikebreakers, the racial tension intensified or increased between the two groups, because now white workers saw black workers as being in direct opposition to them, even though many of the white workers never took responsibility for the fact that they had excluded black workers from their organizations to begin with. In 1916, There was a major strike in Seattle along the docks, the Longshore Strike. This is a long quote. I'll let you work your way through it. The whole seaport, the whole port of Seattle shut down. The companies were in a quandary as to what to do. Interestingly, they turned to college students at the University of Washington as strikebreakers. Unfortunately, the college students couldn't hang, as the kids say. They didn't last very long. And as a result, the employers turned to blacks from the South. They brought up 400 African Americans from New Orleans to work as strikebreakers. This was the largest single contingent of blacks to ever arrive in the city at one time. And so that in and of itself was rent with tension. That development itself was going to generate a tremendous amount of tension. This is Horace Cayton Jr. writing in his autobiography about the strike and about the way in which the strikebreakers were treated. You've seen this. I won't go through all of it. But this is not what we usually identify with Seattle. This is not the way in which we like to think of ourselves or our history. And yet this kind of racial violence, and this is what it is, this kind of racial violence existed in Seattle as well. But I would suggest to you, even as you read that, the black workers retaliated in the face of such violence. As at least 3 people who were interviewed during the period reminded me and reminded others, strikebreakers gave, and then these are their terms, strikebreakers gave as good as they got. In other words, the strikebreakers lashed out. One strikebreaker was attacked by white strikers. He shot and killed one of the strikers. At one other time, in one other instance, the strikebreakers, tired of the kind of harassment that they had received at the hands of the strikers, went to the Union Hall, the striking Union Hall, and they essentially chased everybody out of the hall. And on one hand, that probably made them feel very good. On the other hand, it just exacerbated the racial tension between the two groups. I would suggest to you that it really wasn't until the late 1930s that blacks and whites would work side by side on the docks in Seattle. And I would also suggest to you, I'm getting way ahead of myself now, it's not until the 1970s that most unions would be integrated in Seattle. And what is this year? This is 2006. There are still unions that are overwhelmingly white in Seattle. In other words, there is still the attempt to try to exclude blacks and other works of color. If the situation for black men was difficult, the situation for black women was nothing short of dire. African-American women had far fewer opportunities to work. As I said before, they were mostly maids. They were either maids in private houses. If they were lucky, they were maids in department stores. There are numerous examples of this. Let me give you one example. Irene Grayson, well, this is not Irene Grayson, but this is a representative photograph from the period. Irene Grayson worked as a maid from 1914 when she arrived in Seattle until 1950 when she retired. Let me repeat that. She worked as a maid from 1914 until 1950. And of course, she made a maid's wages throughout that time period. And this is what she said: I worked 7 years during the 1920s without a vacation. I worked 7 years without a vacation. And some weeks I worked every Saturday and Sunday, as well as every day of the week, for $2.10 a day. Her situation is typical, or was typical, for a whole host of black women in Seattle throughout this time period. We've already talked about Susie Revels Cayton. This woman was college educated, and yet the only job that she could find was as a maid. Let's talk about her daughter. Her daughter, Madge, went to the University of Washington. As a matter of fact, graduated from the University of Washington in 1924 with a degree in international business. What would a degree in international business do for someone now? You know, that would be cutting edge. So that person with that kind of degree would have his or her future, if you will, sealed, in the sense that they would probably be very, very prosperous. Unfortunately, despite the degree in international business from the University of Washington, Madge Cayton could not find a job in the city except as a maid. And ultimately, she was lucky in that she found the job as a waitress at a small restaurant in downtown Seattle. In other words, blacks, and particularly black women, were excluded from the economic marketplace. They were excluded for the jobs that mattered. This concentration of black folks in these marginal occupations prompted the Northwest Enterprise, which was Seattle's black newspaper at the time, to declare bitterly in 1927, quote, "In Seattle, colored men should have jobs as streetcar motormen and conductors. Black women should have jobs as telephone operators and stenographers," and on and on and on. We want jobs, jobs. After that, everything will come unto us. We want jobs. After that, everything will come unto us. Folks, I don't think they realize how prophetic these words were. The struggle for jobs, the struggle for employment would continue in Seattle, continue for blacks in Seattle well into the 1960s and beyond. In other words, this is not just the story in the 1920s or the 1930s. It's ultimately the paradox of Seattle through most of the 20th century history. W.E.B. Du Bois never recognized that paradox. He never noticed that although blacks in the city enjoyed social and political freedoms that were almost unheard of in the rest of the country, they were nonetheless denied economic opportunity. And in that regard, their lives were very much like those of their counterparts throughout the rest of the country. Seattle proved a very strange racial paradise indeed. Despite, or perhaps because, of the harsh economic conditions, Seattle's black population decided to, if you will, entertain itself. Maybe indeed it was engaged in an escapism, but in the process of engaging in this escapism through entertainment, they were going to create a musical scene that was unique on the West Coast. And remember what I said earlier, that in many respects, Seattle's situation was very much like that for blacks in other areas of the West and other areas of the country. But in one very important respect, Seattle's jazz scene, Seattle would be different. Seattle would be almost unique. Seattle's African-American population in 1920 was obviously small. We've talked about this, less than 3,000 people. Moreover, Seattle was remote, if we can say this. Seattle was remote from the cities where jazz was becoming famous, places like New Orleans and Kansas City and Chicago, and of course, New York City. Yet this tiny community became part of a remarkably vibrant jazz scene that would last over 3 decades in the 1920s, 30s, and into the 1940s. Here, literally hundreds of musicians, famous and not so famous, famous and barely known, came and went or stayed and influenced younger musicians, both native and migrant. Less than 7 miles from where we stand right now stood the great Black and Tan Club. This is at the, help me out, I think this is at the corner of 12th and Jackson. You guys, everybody in this room has probably passed 12th and Jackson. You probably passed the Black and Tan. The Black and Tan was a remarkable club. I don't have time to get into it in a lot of detail here, but it was a remarkable club that hosted all of the greats, local and national. For instance, in the 1920s, it hosted Oscar Holden and Fats Waller. In the 1930s, Julian Henson and Louis Armstrong. In the 1940s, Al Pierre and Sarah Vaughan. In other words, these are the kinds of people that are playing. But what makes the Black and Tan so interesting is that it was part of an entertainment district that stretched all the way up Jackson Street. There were at one time, and I think around 1939, there were over 27 clubs in a 7-block radius along Jackson. That was an entertainment district, and it was an entertainment district that was unlike any of the others in the country. As Robert Wright said, as he recalled 30 years later, in 1935 and 1936, you could see as many white people on 12th and Jackson as midnight as you saw on 3rd and Union at midday. In other words, Jackson Street was rocking. Jackson Street was the place to be, and it was the place to be because of all these wonderful jazz musicians. Let me go back to the Black and Tan Club. Essentially, I was talking about a black-owned establishment, although ironically, it's in the basement of a Japanese store. And I think this is very indicative of the way in which we need to talk about the interaction between those two groups, the blacks and Asians. Indeed, from the 1920s on, black musicians played in numerous instances in venues that were owned or controlled by Chinese Americans. Not so much Japanese. There were a few Japanese American club owners, but mostly Chinese club owners. The Chinese Gardens, the China Castle, the Manila Dance Hall, despite this name was actually Chinese-owned, and the Hong Kong Chinese Society Club were all venues for jazz played by black musicians. The Chinese Gardens, owned by Charlie Louis, was home to dozens of black jazz musicians from 1931 until the time it closed in 1946. I don't know of any other place, certainly on the West Coast, and I can't imagine anywhere else in the country where we had that kind of phenomenon, where there were black musicians who were playing to white audiences in clubs that were owned by the Chinese. Saxophonist Marshall Royal recalled, these were a different type of people in Seattle. He's talking about Seattle in the 1920s, in 1930s. These were a different type of people in Seattle. They were nice, they were cordial. I'm not just speaking of the black people, I'm talking about the Chinese guys. They were our buddies. I'm talking about the Chinese guys. They were our buddies. The connections with Asian American club owners in Seattle brought international opportunities as well. By the 1930s, musicians from Black Seattle, those who had worked at the Black and Tan Club or the Chinese Gardens, began to play in Shanghai in ballrooms such as Casanova or St. Anne's Dance Hall. And I want to bring up, well, this is Tokawa Hotel. This is where there was a club in the basement of this building, but more importantly, this is a building where a lot of black musicians stayed. When they were in Seattle, those who traveled, those who toured, they stayed in this building. And some of them who lived in Seattle, stayed in this building as well. But I want to get to the next slide because it's nothing short of remarkable. Earl Whaley is not from Seattle, and his band wasn't headquartered in Seattle, but he spent a lot of time here. But you see this slide, he's not here in Seattle, he's in Shanghai, China in 1937. Unfortunately for him, he's in Shanghai at the time the Japanese invade. And as a result, his whole band is going to literally be put into Japanese concentration camps. And Whaley's, all of the fingers of both of his hands are going to be broken. Other band members will die. Only a few of the band members will actually survive and come back to the United States. But their very experience, their very story suggests that there was a remarkable situation for jazz musicians on the West Coast, and particularly in Seattle. We can talk about Louis Armstrong and where he toured. He never toured Shanghai. He never toured Hong Kong. He never toured Manila, as did black musicians from Seattle at that time. Indeed, Jackson Street had a remarkable run. For 30 years, it was the capital of jazz in the Pacific Northwest, and I would argue that it rivaled much larger Los Angeles as the capital of jazz throughout the entire West. The interaction between black jazz musicians and the Asian club owners speaks to the larger question of interaction between the two groups, that is, between African Americans and Asian Americans. As I said before, Jackson Street was a shared public space for a variety of groups of color, and this was extremely rare, exceedingly rare in the West, and unheard of, literally unheard of anywhere else in the country. Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, and black all occupied that public space along Jackson. It was one of the few places in pre-World War II urban America where a black barbershop stood next to a Japanese grocery, which in turn bordered a Filipino social club. Shared space, however, did not automatically translate into shared experiences. First, there was the language and cultural barriers, and these barriers separated the groups from each other as much as they separated the Asian groups from the African Americans. Moreover, we need to recall that there were class barriers as well. The Japanese tended to be much better educated and far wealthier, relatively speaking, than their other Asian groups, than their Asian counterparts. And certainly they were much better off economically than African Americans. Finally, even if the groups experienced similar discrimination in housing and employment, and certainly the Japanese did in Seattle in the 1920s and 1930s, they were excluded from the unions, they were excluded from certain neighborhoods, and on and on. In other words, the pattern of discrimination was very similar to that of African Americans. Even if they experienced similar discrimination in housing and employment, they pursued radically different strategies in confronting it. James Sakamoto, a founder of the Japanese American Citizen League, the JACL. And by the way, the JACL became the defense organization for the Japanese community. It became, in a way, the Japanese NAACP. The JACL was founded right here in Seattle. James Sakamoto repudiated the militancy of the Seattle NAACP. In other words, he compared the approach of the JACL with the NAACP. And he said the Japanese should follow another path. Quote, agitation begets agitation, and this can never lead to the best results. His fellow JACL founder, Saburo Kido, said, or indeed he was much more precise in his statement, we believe that complaints against race prejudice are not justified. They only show that something is lacking in the initiative or the ability of the one who complains, unquote. These are powerful statements, and I don't mean to say that they are wrong. I mean to suggest that not every group of color recognizes discrimination, or maybe I should say that responds to discrimination in the same way. And we as historians need to understand the different responses. We need to understand in a practical manner that people are going to call for different responses. As a matter of fact, James Sakamoto was called by his biographer the Booker T. Washington of Japanese America. And that's a very interesting term because Booker T. Washington is obviously not Japanese. In other words, there are black people who are calling for what would be known as an accommodationist strategy as well. And of course, there's going to be an intense debate within the black community as to whether that would work. It worked for the Japanese for reasons that I won't go into now, but it worked for the Japanese in ways that it couldn't work for African Americans. But the fact remains that they took a different approach from that of African Americans at the time. One Asian American group, the Filipinos, did join forces politically with Seattle's blacks during the 1930s. In 1935 and in 1937, the Filipino community of Seattle, which was actually a coalition, it's not just the community in general, it's a coalition of various Filipino organizations. The Filipino community of America joined with the Seattle NAACP and the recently formed Seattle Urban League in attempting to challenge the efforts to pass an anti-interracial marriage bill. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but suffice to say that there were a number of people in Seattle in the mid-1930s who were concerned about the increasing frequency of interracial marriage. Not interracial marriage between blacks and whites, interracial marriage between Filipinos and whites. And as a consequence, there was legislation that was introduced into the state legislature in Olympia to try to block such marriages. The legislation was crafted and promoted by none other than Warren Magnuson, the future US Senator. And of course, we all know that Magnuson later on would become a champion of civil rights. He would defend the very people that he's attacking at this point. But in 1935, Warren Magnuson was on the other side of this particular issue because he was concerned about the prospect of interracial marriage between Filipinos and European Americans, particularly European American women. This coalition came together. It wasn't just the blacks, it wasn't just the Filipinos. It also included the very liberal or the very left Washington Commonwealth Federation. It also included a number of progressive labor unions. Now, I had said earlier that for the most part, labor unions were racially exclusive. But there were a handful of labor unions that were racially inclusive, and those labor unions supported the efforts of the blacks and the Filipinos to block this bill. The upshot of all of this, to try to make a long story short, the upshot of all this is that this coalition was successful in blocking those bills in 1935 and in 1937. And as such, they kept Seattle and kept Washington's distinction as one of only 6 states in the country that did not have a ban on interracial marriage. Let me repeat that. Washington was one of only 6 states in the country that did not have a ban. California, Oregon, Nevada, you name your western state. All of them had bans. Indeed, Seattle was the only state in the West that did not have this ban, and this coalition prevented that ban from being introduced at that time. I argue that the workings of this coalition, plus the fact that blacks and Asians lived in the same social space, plus the fact that you had a very interesting coming together of peoples around jazz, all made for Seattle's experience to be different. Not maybe unique. I don't know if I'm ready to use the word unique, but certainly different from that of other African Americans in other areas of the West, and certainly African Americans in other areas of the country. I promise you, LA, we have a few minutes left. Let me talk about LA. Let me at least get us started on LA. I probably won't finish it, but I want to introduce you to some ideas about the largest African American urban community in the West. By 1910, Los Angeles, with an African American population of 7,500, had the largest black community west of Texas. Modern Los Angeles begins with the land boom of the 1880s, which propelled the black population from 102 in 1880 to 1,200 10 years later. And of course, you can see the figures. I won't go through all of this. That land boom affected everyone. In other words, a whole world rushed into Los Angeles. Los Angeles' entire population jumped from about 11,000 in 1880 to, I think, something like 70,000 10 years later. And between 1880 and 1920, I want you to mark these figures, between 1880 and 1920, Los Angeles population went from 11,000 to 1.2 million. From 11,000 to 1.2 million. And as all these people come in, they're buying land. And of course, the people who are lucky enough to be in LA before this rush are going to be very, very successful. And one of those people was none other than Bridget Biddy Mason. We talked about her earlier as that slave who gained her freedom in 1856 in Los Angeles. In 1866, she homesteaded land. There was urban homesteading as well. She homesteaded land in Los Angeles. And by 1872, she had become a pillar of the community. She was probably the wealthiest black woman in Los Angeles at that time. And she didn't have to do anything. She just had to hold on to the land, which became more and more valuable. As a matter of fact, her land was on the outskirts of Los Angeles when she homesteaded in 1866. By 1890, it was on the outskirts of downtown Los Angeles. In other words, and of course, it had become much, much more valuable. And to give you an idea of the place of Biddy Mason's old homestead, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Los Angeles, but if you go there today and you go to the Ronald Reagan building, which is in downtown Los Angeles, and you go directly across the street, you'll be in a complex, in a shopping complex, which is where Biddy Mason's homestead once stood. In other words, this is very much part of downtown Los Angeles. One wonders what would have happened if the family had held on up until this point, but they didn't. Mason established the first AME, or the first African Methodist Episcopal Church. When I say first, that's the name of the church, First AME Church, as you can see here. She founded it in 1872, and she paid all of the expenses, including the expense for the minister, for over 20 years in order to, quote, hold it for my people, her word, although she continued to go to a predominantly white church. Mason's descendants continued to profit from the growing value of Southern California real estate. Her son-in-law, Charles Owens, before his death in 1882, purchased valuable parcels around the homestead, and his grandson continued to do this, continued to build around that. And in 1905, he constructed a $250,000 building. Now, these are $1905, a $250,000 six-story building on the edge of downtown Los Angeles, on the original site. Let me see if we have this. Yeah, this is part of the Mason-Owens business block. So the Mason-Owens family became very, very prosperous. Unfortunately, that prosperity didn't extend to other Angelenos. Most of the newcomers who came to Los Angeles, especially the black newcomers, found employment as construction and repair workers for the Southern Pacific Railroad and the Santa Fe Railroad, or they worked as cooks and porters and waiters and maids, the same old story. During the first decade of the 20th century, the black population of Los Angeles jumped to about 7,500, and it surpassed the Bay Area's population and became the center of black population, the black community in California. Early 20th century black Angelenos organized institutions and organizations, and in the interest of brevity, I'm not going to list all of them. The most interesting of these organizations, though, I do want to talk about for a minute, it's the Los Angeles Forum. Now, every time I say Los Angeles Forum, everybody thinks about where the Lakers used to play. This is not what I'm talking about. The Los Angeles Forum was an organization crafted by African Americans about the turn of the century, that is, the beginning of the 20th century, and it was essentially, as the name suggests, a community forum. It was a place where people could come together to discuss issues affecting African America, especially affecting the community. And the forum continued to operate in that fashion. Even though it started in a very small black community, it continued to operate as the community grew right up until 1942. That is, from 1900 until 1942, this was the premier political organization, not the NAACP. This was the premier political organization in Los Angeles. It was also the organization that started a whole host of scholarships, or provided a whole host of scholarships for African-American women and men who were growing up in Los Angeles. One woman who received the scholarship, Dr. Ruth Temple, became in 1910 the first female black physician on the West Coast. And her medical school fees were paid by the forum. In other words, the forum was concerned with education. They were also concerned with community uplift. They were also concerned with dealing with the various problems that were facing the African-American community. I want to name one other organization, the Sojourner Truth Industrial Club, which was established by black women in 1906. And it was established to, quote, establish a Christian dwelling that would be a safe refuge, unquote, for African-American women, single black women who were coming into the city. In other words, as black women came without husbands or without accompanying families, they could be exploited. And this Los Angeles club, the Sojourner Truth Industrial Club, was there to try to take care of them as best they could. But in the process, the club organized in 1907 one of the first daycare facilities in Los Angeles, and we believe one of the first daycare facilities in the entire country. Los Angeles would continue to grow. Let me give you some examples. This is the New Age. This is one of the newspapers in Black Los Angeles, but this is the newspaper of note. This is the California Eagle. It was founded by a man, James Nehemiah, in 1879. It continued to publish until 1966, and for the most of the years, it was edited by Charlotta Bass. Charlotta Bass is a remarkable woman. Again, we don't have time to talk about her. She went from being a conservative Republican to a member of the Progressive Party in 1952, and not just a member of the Progressive Party. She was actually the vice presidential candidate on the Progressive Party ticket in 1952. Thus, she has the distinction of being the first black woman nominated for to a presidential party ticket in the history of the country. We think about Shirley Chisholm coming along a little bit later, but Charlotta Bass was much earlier. Black Los Angeles by the 1920s would not only continue to grow, it would explode. And as it exploded, it became, as one wag said, it became the Harlem of the West. It became literally the Harlem of the West. Black Los Angeles had Central Avenue, and Central Avenue had a whole host of businesses, far more African-American businesses than anywhere else in the West. On the avenue could be found black-owned theaters, saving and loan associations, automobile dealerships, and of course, the Dunbar Hotel. The Dunbar Hotel was the largest, the most opulent black-owned hotel west of Chicago. It was made famous in 1928 when the NAACP met in Los Angeles for the first time west of the Mississippi River. The National Convention was west of the Mississippi River. They met precisely because they wanted to be in the Dunbar. And the Dunbar became the place for movie stars and celebrities, black movie stars and celebrities for a long, long time. Let me give you some other examples here. The Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company, founded in 1924. Golden State is still around. It's not on Central Avenue anymore, but it's still around. It is the second largest black insurance company in the country today. In other words, it grew, it became prosperous, it is still prosperous in Los Angeles. Los Angeles had in the 1920s along Central Avenue what I call a brief literary renaissance. I've tried to argue against the hordes and hordes of intellectuals from the East who argue that there was only one renaissance and it was in Harlem. I've tried to argue, and I haven't been successful so far. Maybe you guys can carry the torch for me. I've tried to argue that before Langston Hughes, before Arnold Bontemps, and before Wallace Thurman ever made it to Harlem, they were in Los Angeles, and they were writing. And they were attempting to create a literary renaissance in Los Angeles with magazines, with books. They met at the public library just off Central Avenue. In other words, everything that they would do in Harlem after 1925, they did in Los Angeles in 1924, 1923, 1924, 1925. Wallace Thurman, for instance, was born in Salt Lake City, so he was clearly a Westerner. Arnold Bontemps was born in Louisiana, but he spent most of his life in Watts. And of course, Langston Hughes, who was arguably the most famous of the Renaissance poets and writers, came from Kansas, and on and on and on. In other words, there was a huge black Western input in the very famous Renaissance that took place, some people say that took place in Harlem. Sebastian's Cotton Club, I use this, I'm throwing this image up quickly, I use this to show that there were a host of black nightclubs all along Central Avenue and elsewhere. Sebastian's was actually not on Central Avenue, but it was close enough to be considered part of this array of nightclubs. Now, I will admit, these clubs were larger and more elaborate than the clubs in Seattle, but I don't know if they had any better jazz. I don't know if the jazz was any better in these clubs than in Seattle. What they did have, unfortunately for Seattle, they did have the Hollywood stars. Humphrey Bogart, Clark Gable, Mae West would come to these clubs. They would hang out with black musicians. They would hang out with some of the blacks who attended these clubs. And they would, quote, make the scene or help make the scene for Los Angeles, for the Los Angeles jazz scene. I use the reference to Clark Gable and Humphrey Bogart and Mae West as a kind of a segue into the next discussion, and that's Hollywood's black royalty. For one brief moment, maybe more than a brief moment, because I think we can argue that it continues to this day. But in the beginning, Hollywood would see African Americans in roles. Now, some of these roles were problematic, as I'm going to explain in a minute, but they would see African Americans in roles in a whole host of Hollywood productions. And as a result, some black folks would do fairly well. As a matter of fact, there's one ironic statement made by Louise Beavers. When someone criticized her for playing the role of a maid in so many movies, she said, well, I'd much rather play a maid in Hollywood than be a maid in real life. In other words, she made a great deal of money even playing a maid in Hollywood. Here's another irony. African Americans, at least when the movie industry started and before it was located in Los Angeles, the movie industry sort of relocates or concentrates in Los Angeles in the second decade of the 20th century. But before the industry located in Southern California and Los Angeles in the place we call Hollywood, it was scattered all over the country, and ironically, black people, for the most part, had non-stereotypical roles. One of the earliest movies that was made by any production company, this was Thomas Edison's production company, was about the Buffalo Soldiers in the Spanish-American War, and it lauded their bravery. And this was the way the situation evolved up until, I would say, the second decade of the 20th century. And then as the industry concentrated in Los Angeles, for reasons that I'm not sure I completely understand, those roles began to change. This is the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. This is one of the black-owned motion picture companies. It started in Omaha, Nebraska. It relocated in California in 1916. It became the largest black-owned company, black-owned motion picture company at the time. Unfortunately, there weren't a lot of examples of the Lincoln company. There were other examples, and that's Stepin Fetchit. Let me talk about Stepin Fetchit, and because in many ways, he is an example, the quintessential example of the tragedy of Hollywood. Stepin Fetchit was born Lincoln Theodore Monroe Andrew Perry. He was born in Florida, and he was in vaudeville for a while. He got his training in vaudeville, and eventually he made it to the West Coast. Unfortunately, he arrived in Hollywood at the time when most of the movie moguls had decided that black people ought to play what the movie moguls considered black people to do and be in real life. They ought to play maids and chauffeurs and butlers, but worse, they ought to play them in stereotype. In other words, they ought to play them as Stepin Fetchit would, as bumbling, shuffling, ignorant people. Indeed, Stepin Fetchit would star in about 25 movies in a 7-year period, and in each one of those movies, he would be what we would now call comic relief, but he would be the bumbling, shuffling, ignorant black person, and that image is what would be projected on the screen in Hollywood across the country and ultimately around the world. Ironically, Stepin Fetchit in real life was nothing like the character that he played in the movies. In real life, he was a demanding person. In real life, he was fantastically wealthy. He made a tremendous amount of money off of all these movies, even though he played these stereotypical roles. He lived the high life. Unfortunately, he lived the high life too well because it's this kind of lifestyle that would ultimately bankrupt him. He spent more money than he took in. But unfortunately, he never understood that his role, his responsibility in those roles that were being projected. Increasingly, the NAACP was critical of him, and the black press, so much so that by 1937, 1938, he ultimately lost those roles. And by 1939, he was bankrupt and he died in poverty. And I won't say very much about Hattie McDaniel. You all know that she won the first Oscar long before Denzel Washington and Sidney Poitier and all the others. And she played the stereotypical role, but in some ways, she played against the stereotype. In other words, she turned what would have been a stereotypical role into a much more assertive role. The Oscar was a prestigious award, and it was nothing short of remarkable that this black woman would receive that award for her role in Gone with the Wind. Black Hollywood, throughout this period, never received what I would call the the recognition for its real talents. Yes, there were some people like Lena Horne or Louis Armstrong who played in movies that were directed at black audiences, that were non-stereotypical. There were these images that were projected. But these movies constituted no more than about 15 to 20% of the movies that were made about black folks or movies that had black people in them. And this situation wouldn't change until, I would say, the 1960s. Although with the blaxploitation movies of the 1970s, some would argue that the situation actually got worse. Black Hollywood is still problematic, folks, but it was certainly problematic at that particular time. I want to talk about one other phenomenon in Southern California. Black folks knew, most black folks knew, that they wouldn't become Hollywood stars. They knew that they wouldn't become wealthy media moguls and the like, but they could own real estate. Black people in Los Angeles arrived in California at the time when real estate was accessible to almost everyone. Let me give you an example, and I think it's a remarkable example. On the Central Avenue, or in the Central Avenue district in 1925, one could buy a California cottage, a home like that. It's a modest home for $900. One could pay as little as $100 down and $20 a month in house payments. This house, even today, would probably be worth $500,000 in Los Angeles. But at that time, housing was cheap enough to be accessible, to be affordable, and it's not surprising then that Los Angeles blacks had the highest rate of home ownership in the country in 1940. As a matter of fact, even though they didn't have economic opportunity, even those janitors praised the fact that they could buy homes, and that made Los Angeles far different. But unfortunately, Los Angeles had an ugly Achilles heel. There is opportunity, but there's also challenge. You can see Sidney Dones. Sidney Dones is an African-American president of the California Realty Board. This is the Black Real Estate Association. And he's talking about bringing blacks to California to enjoy the always sunshine and the offer to the American Negro, the American dream, literally the American dream. Sidney Dones actually moves to an up-and-coming middle-class, actually upper-class community called Watts. Watts is one of the first integrated neighborhoods, or cities, actually, in the country. It is 1/3 Latino, 1/3 black, 1/3 white by 1940, and it was considered the model of the future. Things happen, and I'll talk a little bit later on in a subsequent lecture about what happened to Watts. But Watts held out the promise. It was advertised in all the Eastern papers as one of the best suburbs in the country for African Americans. Yet there was a problem. There were restricted covenants all over California. Yes, blacks had the opportunity to own homes, but only along Central Avenue, only in the Central District. 90% of Los Angeles was literally off limits. And as one person said, we were encircled by invisible walls of steel. The whites surrounded us and made it impossible for us to go beyond those walls. Black folks would fight against those walls. Black folks would fight against the restricted covenants. And that battle would continue through the rest of the 1930s, and I would argue it would continue well into the 1960s and the 1970s in Los Angeles and in Seattle. And we're going to talk about that battle in both places in a subsequent lecture. Thank you very much. We'll end at this point.